Shields and swords, field of wars, fighting my blood down to the core. Warriors from medieval age, fear the reign of night brigades. Crusades into the room, moving through the temples and tombs. Scared and placed, prepare to face Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. 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 Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
If you're reading Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain because you want to read about King Arthur, and you've gone through the first 3/4 of it and there's no mention of King Arthur, it's got to be a big relief when you finally reach the section on Arthur. And you have to be thinking, at last, that's what I picked this thing up for. Which is a shame if you just sort of glided through everything else, because there are so many wonderful things before that. But now we're finally to Arthur. And here we can see the beginnings of what we would think about as Arthurian legend today. So, for example, you have his sword Caliburn, who you maybe would know better as Excalibur, right? And you can see the connections between those two names and so forth and so on. And you kind of see a lot of the roots of what will become what we would think of as canonical Arthurian legend, though, of course, Arthurian legend will vary through time, across the centuries, in different countries, right? Well, what I want to talk about today is actually King Arthur as a setting. Now, this is something that the great Elizabeth Sklar, who taught me, used to point out, which is that King Arthur is often more of a setting for telling other people's stories than he is a character in his own right. Now that being said, obviously Arthur is often a character in his own right, and Geoffrey of Monmouth really has Arthur as a character. Arthur does a lot of his own fighting. But when you start reading a lot of different Arthurian romances, a lot of different Arthurian legends, you then realize King Arthur doesn't really do much in them. He's just kind of the chairman of the committee, right? And in here, we see the origins of this. Now, when I say the origins of this, there's no reason to think, in fact, lots of reason to think not, that Geoffrey of Monmouth invented King Arthur. He didn't invent King Arthur himself, right? But we can sort of see how Arthur's becoming a setting. So first, let's look at a clip here. Arthur then began to increase his personal entourage by inviting very distinguished men from far distant kingdoms to join it. In this way, he developed such a code of courtliness in his household that he inspired peoples living far away to imitate him. The result was that even the man of noblest birth, once he was roused to rivalry, thought nothing of himself unless he wore his arms and dressed in the same way as Arthur's knights. At last, the fame of Arthur's generosity and bravery spread to the very ends of the earth, and the kings and countries far across the sea trembled at the thought that they might be attacked and invaded by him, and so lose control of the lands under their dominion. Okay, so here we see in this clip, already there's a sense that Arthur is more than just a great king. That there's something about his code, and that he's gathering other people to him. And that gathering up other people to him allows those people to have their own stories within this code that we have here. We also have something interesting here where they say that the fame of Arthur's generosity and bravery spread, and therefore his enemies were afraid of him. Note it wasn't his power, but it was his code that made them afraid of him. And there's a sign in here that somehow Arthur's power is connected more to his code of conduct, his code of courtliness, that he is embodies himself and is encouraging among his knights and his allies. That is what really is where really he draws his authority from. Now, the other thing that we see here, which is a common trope in Arthurian legend, is notice that Arthur finally sort of wins and there's a time of peace. I think there's like 9-year jump. And then Arthur's having a tournament, a party, right? And then Roman legates show up and they say, hey, Rome's mad at you, and etc. Right? And we start the second half, which is basically the war. Most of it's the war with Rome. And this is a setup that occurs again and again and again and again in Arthurian legend, which is Arthur is king, everything is stable, he's been promoting his code, and they're all gathered together for a feast, or they're all gathered together for a tournament. Now, sometimes what happens at that point, there's two main streams. One is King Arthur says, well, we're not going to begin eating until someone tells us a tale of their heroism. And then someone tells a tale, and that's the frame, and inside that's the tale that we're all there to hear. The other thing that happens is they're all gathered together, and then some force from the outside, whether it is messengers from Rome, or it is someone saying, oh, there's giants out there, or it's the Green Knight. Some outside force comes and ultimately interrupts the peace of what will be known as Camelot. Not here yet, but what will be known as Camelot. We're still Caerleon in this case, right? As the name of that. And that's where the story comes from. And so these two things, first, this idea of Arthur gathering all these brave people to him, and then second, when they're all gathered together, an outside force comes and interrupts the peace and civilization of what we will later call Camelot. This becomes a kind of framework around which, so much Arthurian legend is built. Now, the other point I want to make about this is, at the beginning we discussed the idea that that this is connected with the Trojan War, right? The Britons are the new Trojans, etc. I think we also see echoes of the Trojan War in the Arthur section. Because if you'll notice, all his fights with the Saxons and with Gaul, etc., all the fights that he has up until the Roman War, those fights, it really emphasizes, his success on the battlefield, people suing for peace, or they were hungry, or the enemy are barely characters. But when we get to the Roman section, you'll notice it's how brave the Romans were, how difficult opponents they were. Now, of course, some of that is just simply recognizing the power of the Roman Empire and what it had been at its height. But I think also in that we see echoes of the Trojan War, where the Greeks and the Trojans are enemies, but in Homer and in Virgil, there is this idea that they are both brave, in some way both noble, and even though one side is going to win, it isn't like the other side were terrible or weak, and that this is the real height of this. And then finally, we see once again Geoffrey returning to the theme that the only thing that can take down the Britons is internal treachery, because once again, in this case, it's Mordred who then betrays the king and thus brings the downfall of his kingdom.